911, what is your emergency? What is going on? Hello?
My mom was a knife. She's shot her. Please.
Who has a knife?
My sister.
Where is your sister?
Quick!
What? I got everyone coming to you, honey. Where is your sister?
Oh, my God! Quick, stop!
I was on patrol, and I heard the call come over dispatch.
Green Drive, I have a female with stab wounds. Attention, ambulance. Ambulance is needed.
You could tell by the tone of her voice that it wasn't normal.
When the police arrived, they found Megan Knafel, who made the 911 call, coming out of the house and say, "You better come in. Hurry."
She was frantically waving her hands for me to hurry up and get in the house, screaming that she's gonna kill my mother. She was very, very panicked, very frantic. So we approached the bedroom door, and I was expecting to hear something. You're being told somebody's being stabbed. There's, some kind of fight going on, but you hear nothing. It was eerie.
Sabrina has a 12-inch bread knife that she is holding in her right hand. She's covered in blood.
I can see blood on the blade. I can see blood on her. Immediately, we started screaming to drop the knife. It almost like snapped her out of whatever she was in, back to some type of reality. I kicked it away from her, and we put her down on the floor. It was a very tense couple seconds.
When I first walked into the house, the scene was horrifying. It was very bloody. The smell of death.
Lisa was laying in between the bed and the wall. There was a lot of blood on the walls, on the bed, and on the ceiling as well.
The coroners documented that Sabrina had stabbed Lisa 178 times.
It was a longer bread knife, and the blade was actually curved. It was bent. It's just, you try to picture in your mind what had to have happened to make that knife bend like that. I could hear a child crying from my left. We opened up the door to clear the closet, and that's when I found a very, very small child screaming.
The suspect, Sabrina Zunich, she was a 18-year-old foster child of Lisa Knafel. Also inside the house was Megan Zanella and Haley Knafel, Megan being 13 and Haley being 3 years old.
The father, Kevin, was away on a trip. He was a truck driver, and he was in Michigan at that point.
Lisa was married before she met Kevin. Her first child, Megan, was actually born in 1999. Her first marriage ended in 2003, and she met Kevin soon after, and they got married in 2006. And the very next year, their daughter, Haley, was born.
Lisa worked for the Cuyahoga County Job and Family Services in the sex division.
She worked on some of the most difficult cases in the county. Caring for children wasn't just a job. She lived it. She brought troubled kids into her home.
Sabrina was in foster care for many years before she came to the Knafels.
Sabrina landing with the Knafels really represented a fresh start for her. She went from a troubled home with their biological father and grandma to a youth shelter where she did not want to be. She's getting along with the family. She's doing great at school. She's not getting in trouble. Things seem to be looking up for her. I couldn't find anything indicating something like this could happen.
Line, please. You remember me, right?
Our main goal when we first interviewed Sabrina was to get Sabrina to tell us exactly what happened. We caught her coming out of the room, so we knew she did it. We wanted to know why.
So what do you recall?
Yesterday,
Mm-hmm.
getting done with my homework, going, I don't know, and that's it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to bed.
And we're at home.
Mm-hmm.
Would anything unusual happen?
I don't know. Everything went fine according to what I knew of.
Starting from when you got home from school yesterday.
I got home, went to doing homework. Then we had hamburger helper. And then I went back to doing my homework. It was like 12. Went upstairs, tried to go to sleep. I couldn't go to sleep, so I went to go get some Advil.
Mm-hmm.
Ibuprofen. Because my head hurt.
Where did you take ibuprofen from?
In Kevin's bathroom. That's
Where?
where I felt. Kevin and Lisa's bedroom.
Kevin and Lisa's bedroom? Okay. We were trying to lock her into a story. Do you remember what the bottle said? We try to go over the same event over and over again to see A, if they're going to change her story, or B, if they're just going to kind of give in and be like, okay, I'm going to tell these guys now because I don't have it in me to lie anymore. Okay. After some point in time, you don't know how long it's been, you can't go to bed because you've got a headache, correct? You go open up the medicine cabinet, white bottle that says ibuprofen. How many did you take?
3.
When she's giving us short, one-word answers, we know she's lying to us. She doesn't have a good explanation for it. She doesn't want to tell us the explanation because the explanation is going to bring long, drawn-out comments.
How do you get along with Kevin?
Kevin and me are cool. I mean, he's more the one that helps me out. Because this has Megan to deal with. And so we made agreements a long time ago that if I need anything, that I can go to Kevin.
How about with Lisa? How do you get along with her?
Me and Lisa have never been the best. She's never seemed to like me, and she's been wanting me out of the house.
What's your thoughts on how Lisa is not alive now?
What?
A Willoughby mother murdered in her own home.
Tonight, police say the woman's foster child is to blame. Authorities say Lisa Canafil was stabbed to death. Her 18-year-old foster daughter is in custody tonight.
Recall coming out of the bedroom with a knife in your hand?
No.
First thing she does is she has an itch on her forehead for no apparent reason. When people touch their face or, start scratching or start tapping their toes, it's a good indication to us that the person's probably lying. They're nervous.
Unless you had a knife. You stabbed Lisa.
I did.
Yes, you did. And Megan called the police.
That can't be true.
Bree, it is. I'm sorry.
This is really dead.
Yes, dead. Sorry.
I don't believe this. Nobody else is hurt.
Nobody else was hurt. Thank goodness.
What we're trying to do here is to get her to open up to us. She looks damaged to us, so we don't want to take a hardline approach with her. We want to take a nice, easy approach with her.
What's going to happen to Haley, Megan, and Kevin?
Haley, Megan, and Kevin are all safe. They're at home. How do you get along with Megan and Haley?
Haley is my everything. I love her.
Okay.
Megan, me and her were up and down. So, what you're saying is true. You're letting me, Haley and Megan, call me her mother?
Correct.
Nobody needs to see that.
No.
Her emotions were up and down. We call that a big pendulum swing. Sometimes she'd be crying, then, she'd want to listen. That is a very big indicator that they're trying to lie or they're covering something up.
Is everything is be okay?
Just
Not with me.
no. It's not going to be okay for a lot of people. Would you tell us if you remembered?
Yes.
Okay. For right now, we're still doing our investigation, but you're under arrest. Lisa's dead, and it appears that you're responsible for that at this time. So that's what the charge is going to be.
Sabrina never denies committing the murder. She just acts confused when I tell her that she's the one who killed Lisa Knafel. We could have waited here for 4 days, and we were probably going to get the same answers from her. We made the decision that we're just going to cut this down because she's not going to give us anything else that we need.
I went out to greet him. He started asking me very strange questions. He wanted me to tell him graphic details about what had just happened to his wife. There are a ton of more relevant things that I would imagine somebody would want to know. How are my kids doing? Can I see my kids? And I just thought that was bizarre.
Police say 18-year-old Sabrina Zunich had been with the victim and her family for about a year and a half.
Everything seemed so normal. And then this happens. Someone finally reaches out and wants you a part of their family. They want to take you in and help you and guide you through life, and you kill. And you do this.
There was some trouble that was stirring in their marriage. Friends of Lisa said that they were talking about possibly getting a divorce because it got that bad. The root of the problem was Sabrina. Kevin, Lisa, and Sabrina did have a meeting with a social worker, and there was a conversation about when Sabrina would leave the Knafel's house.
Sabrina turned 18 when she was still in high school, senior year in high school, and Kevin really wanted to keep being her foster father.
I believe it was all agreed upon that Sabrina would stay at the Knafel house until after she graduated from high school, which would have been in June the following year. I was hoping to find some text messages, some emails, some search history as to why this crime took place. Over the past several weeks, Kevin Knafel and Sabrina text messaged each other over 1,000 times. I did not think it was normal for a foster father and a foster daughter to have thousands of text messages between the two of them.
On the night of the murder, Kevin had a perfect alibi. He was out of town for work, driving his truck in another state. And that night, there were many texts between the two of them. So they had been in contact all night up until the murder.
Where you going? Ron Palmer.
We were confident that Kevin left for work at 8 p.m. the night before the murder, and he didn't get back into town until after Lisa's death. So we want to know from his perspective as to if there was any argument going on at the house before he left.
And then you told me you wanted to talk about his wife's work.
Correct.
That's the subject matter.
Yes.
So,
I told his lawyer that we would just talk about the work, but I was hoping that maybe he would open up and give us some insight as to what was going on and why the reason that this happened.
Kevin, do you know anything that was happening at the house the night before you left for work that night?
well, hang on a second. We just talking about his wife's work. What's going on at the house the night before is not his wife's work.
Okay. Where does your wife work at?
County Children's Family Services.
What does she do there?
She was a social worker for the Children's Section Unit.
He was looking down. There was no tears. There was no anger.
Were you and Lisa in the process of going through a divorce?
Okay, now we're getting outside the scope.
Kevin Knafel was not willing to help the police in finding out exactly what happened to his wife. Why is he not cooperating with us? What is he hiding from us?
We're just trying to figure out what happened that night. His wife was brutally murdered here, and we're trying to help him. He can help us in the investigation.
He wasn't within 100 miles of the house when that happened.
I understand that, but he was with them prior to leaving the house, so he can discuss what the house was like prior to him leaving.
He was just very muted and just kind of there, just staring down most of the time. It could be a sign of him lying. It could be a sign of nervousness. It could be that, he didn't want to be there.
We're not going to get into, the relationship between Kevin and Lisa. It's just, you got a bloody girl with a bloody knife.
You know what, I apologize for wasting your time then, because...
Well, how about your relationship with any of the other children in the household? I mean, how about your relationship with Sabrina? You didn't discuss anything with that?
No.
Kevin?
No.
I mean, you can feel free to talk.
He's got lawyers right next to him.
I understand, or he can still say what he wants to say.
Except that we're not going to answer any more questions.
Okay, we're done here then.
Okay.
Kevin refused to answer, and his attorney refused to let him answer. This interview did bring Kevin even more as a suspect at this point, just for the pure fact that he didn't even have a willingness to want to help the investigators in his wife's brutal murder.
Kevin, according to court records, faced significant money issues. He was in debt.
I would characterize Kevin Knafel as money hungry. Everything that Kevin did and thought about was about money. Kevin Knafel took out approximately $750,000 worth of life insurance on Lisa Knafel. Back in April of that year, he terminated his own life insurance and his kid's life insurance, but kept Lisa's life insurance.
He got more than $750,000 after Lisa's death, and he used that to pay on a previously foreclosed upon house. He used that to buy a new car, to take flying lessons. Records show that he and his mother purchased a $225,000 house in Summerfield, Florida. Seeing the things that Kevin spent his money on, talking to friends who noticed how cold and indifferent he was about the murder, and piecing all these things together, it really painted a story.
So a proffer is a good faith first step when the defense attorney, the prosecution meet with the suspect. It's an opportunity for them to be 100% complete, honest, and tell exactly what happened. It's a first step into a plea agreement. We cannot use this against her in court.
What we believe from conversations is that what led up to this homicide, to this murder, is that there was another party involved in planning that.
Yes. It was Kevin Knafel, my foster father. It was Kevin's idea, and it was talked about after we were having sexual relations, and him and Lisa were having problems in marriage. He wanted to get a divorce, but Haley, which is a 3-year-old daughter of his and her, was in the picture, and he wanted full custody. She would get custody, or it would be shared, and he didn't want that happening. So the alternative was for this to happen.
When was it, after you started to live there on a daily basis, that your relationship with Kevin changed? When did the sexual nature start to change?
It all started not with sex, but with massages, because he was a truck driver and his legs would cramp, so it was inner thigh. Then it progressively got into sex.
Does he ever tell you, hey, you can't tell anybody about this?
All the time.
Did he say what would happen if you told
Then
him?
you'd be taken out of my care and I could lose my foster parent license.
What did you say in response to that?
I would never do that.
Okay.
Tell on him.
As Sabrina and Kevin's relationship continued, Sabrina described the increasing tension she felt from Lisa, and that Sabrina felt that she wasn't welcome in the house anymore.
Lisa being in the field of, working for the Job and Family Services in the sex division, I think she had a pretty good inkling on what was going on.
So then did you think that she was being harsher with you?
Oh, yes.
Okay, and were you resentful about that?
No, at this point in time, I was like, no, I need to do this. I want this to work. I have all this going on. I can be successful. I'm going to get my wildest dreams met.
So Kevin convinced Sabrina that if she did kill Lisa and did get caught, that she would only do 2 to 5 years, that he would protect her, and that after she got out, that he would be there with her. They would buy a house, and basically she can be like a mother figure to Haley.
So when does he start talking to you about divorce?
It was 3 months before. He said, well, look, I'm going to kill myself if she doesn't leave because I can't deal with this anymore. And so when he said that, it kind of triggered me. I was like, no, I don't want that to happen. And so I was like, okay, I'll do it.
Given Sabrina's history of feeling abandoned and essentially struggling her whole life and feeling like she was no longer struggling, that brought up great feelings in Sabrina, feelings that essentially led to the murder.
So have you talked to him since then?
No, nada, no money on my books, no letters, no calls, no nothing. Nothing.
That's when we learned that Kevin helped plan this murder. It was calculated, and essentially Kevin using Sabrina to get his wife out of the picture and to collect life insurance money.
So tell me if you remember the first time you talked about it.
It was brought up in the car on the way to school. He broke down and cried and said, I'm taking my life or she needs to be dead.
Why doesn't he kill her?
Because then Haley wouldn't have a father. He'd be out in prison, and basically he convinced me that I wouldn't get caught.
Before the actual murder, another plot was supposed to happen. They were talking about this hitman.
I know you said that you didn't tell anybody that you were planning on killing Lisa.
Can I tell you that I
did have somebody else know about it, and it was Autumn Pavlik. She knew about it, was going to have people from Cleveland do it.
Autumn Pavlik was Sabrina Zunich's friend. They had met at South High School. Autumn got roped into the murder plot because Sabrina approached Autumn and asked her if she can get a hitman. I guess Autumn used to live down in a different section of town where she was around that kind of activity.
And how many times would you say that you talked about that plan?
It was all planned in about a month. All the specifics were 2 weeks before what was going to happen.
And then during the time when you would see Lisa, I mean, would you think like, oh, I can't do this?
My heart would beat out of my chest when just thinking about it. I still sit here in disbelief that I did it. That's not me.
So when you would have those moments of self-doubt, okay, what would convince you to do it?
That it would be for Haley's best interest. That's what he manipulated me with. The plan was me not to get caught, and me and him to live together with Haley, and me be a mother figure to her and have a relationship.
During his proffer, she seemed very honest with us. She gave good eye contact with us. There was no delay in between her answers. She was very direct.
And was there any discussion about what knife to use?
Yes.
How did that go down?
We went to the kitchen, he showed me, and
showed you what?
The knife and which one to use. It was, use this bread knife because there's gripping on it and there's ridges and it's long.
That's the highest number of stab wounds I've ever seen. So how did you go about that?
I can't say I don't remember, but I don't know what came over me because she got up, she was able to fight it, and I guess that's what made it to
Then
be.
why did you stop when you realized, oh, this isn't going the way I thought it would?
Because I said, well, it's too late now. I'm going to go to jail anyway. Matter, just get it done.
Sabrina's childhood, I believe, is probably the most important thing to understand why something like this could happen. Sabrina had never experienced a stable family, a loving household, the sense of security, the sense of belonging. Kevin seemed to know how to prey on Sabrina's vulnerabilities.
Myself and Chief Assistant Prosecutor Karen went out to California and knocked on her door. We introduced ourselves, and she says, I've been expecting you guys. In later October of 2012, Autumn Pavlik actually moved out to California, and that's where she received a phone call from Sabrina Zunich asking, are we going to be able to do this hitman thing? We confirmed that while Autumn was on the telephone with Sabrina, Kevin was in the background.
Give us an idea of the number of times that Sabrina brought up with you about this hitman.
Like 4 times. She'd ask me about it a lot.
But yet, then when Kevin gets on, I mean, you had to think, wow, this is serious. Now, this adult's involved in this. Were you surprised that he was also talking to you about that?
I was. I mean, at first I thought, maybe she's just full of it. But when he got on the phone, it became a reality. I'm like, okay, well, if I can talk her out of it, and if I can make it so where him manipulating her is no longer there, then maybe it won't happen.
Deep in Autumn's mind, she said she was never going to actually get the hitman. She was just trying to push it off. Hopefully that she would just not want to do this. Would you try to talk sense into her and like, you know, you don't need to do this?
I would. She wouldn't listen. She was completely set. When a person like that has their mindset, it's set.
Just remember, you're always in contact with us. You know, they can hear you, so if you need anything, just say so. So you have audio and video on the key fob. You don't have to touch anything. You don't have to do anything to it.
We just want to try to get Autumn to have Kevin try to talk about the murder of his wife. Try to get him to talk about their plan of the hitman or of the robbery and of the life insurance policy.
Just figured I'd stop over because I've been trying to reach you and we're out here to maybe go see Sabrina and wanted to see if I could talk to you. If it's all right.
Try to get past all this crap.
Yeah, me too, but there's cops that have been contacting my dad trying to find me, and I have no idea what's going on. Like, what am I supposed to say to them? Because of the whole, like, the hitman thing that we had talked about on the phone.
I don't know what to tell you.
If somebody's accusing you of being involved in something you know you're not involved, you know, you would say something like, what are you talking about? I have no idea what you're talking about. You're crazy.
I mean, how many times in someone's life do they say that they want to kill somebody? That's not what they mean.
But she also said that you and her, like, collaborated or put together some type of plan.
I thought you said you haven't talked to her.
No, when before it all happened, before everything happened.
If I wanted someone dead, it would have been with a gun, because I have a lot of them.
It's just, I mean, if somebody's talking about a hitman, are you involved in something like that, or are you not involved in something like that? It's pretty simple.
Now you have to face this situation because, you know, we just didn't know.
I'm not in any situation right now.
Well, of course you are. You lost your wife and...
Well, that's the situation I'm in. We gotta keep going.
I got an arrest warrant for Kevin Knafel. Early in the morning, we went to Kevin Knafel's house and we arrested him. I don't think he was surprised. It was kind of weird because he was sleeping up in the bedroom where was Sabrina's room.
So we're good to go around? Yes, sir. We would like you to talk to us to give us some insight on some things. We have a lot of facts as to your involvement in this case. And we would like to know your side of the story on us and what happened.
What was the relationship now with Sabrina and Lisa and you? How's everything?
And
gelling?
Megan and Haley.
Yeah, the family. How's everything gelling? Had its good days and had its bad days.
Kevin, on a superficial public perception layer, seemed like an upstanding person. You know, he's working hard, taking care of a foster child.
Tell us about bad days.
Bad days. You started out with Megan and Sabrina getting into it. Or Sabrina either not getting her way about something and reacting to that, or doing something wrong, having to be gotten after.
Who would step in and correct her? Would it be you or would it be Lisa?
It was equal.
Okay.
it got to the point to where Lisa got really frustrated, and so we made a decision for Lisa to just deal with Megan, and I dealt with Sabrina. So, if you could elaborate more on how your relationship with Sabrina developed and evolved. Remember, Kevin, we asked you for the truth when we came here. If we're getting into all this stuff, am I supposed to have my lawyer?
It's your decision. You know you have a choice in the matter.
Well, I already have, but an attorney on record, I think he should be here for all this. Well, like I say, I'm only gonna say the truth, not lie about anything.
You know we have the evidence. I have an 11-count indictment here. And I want to discuss the whole thing with you, the whole puzzle. You know, each piece of the puzzle we put together for the last 8 months. And we have the evidence. So you're at the Y in the road, you have to make a decision.
Your choice to make, Alvin.
I should have a lawyer or see.
That's his right. I mean, his right is to stop, not answer any question without an attorney.
All right, go ahead and stand up. I'm going to pat you down.
We've done the right thing, and we had the right person. Kevin Knafel was 100% involved.
All right, come with me.
A Lake County grand jury indicted the man for plotting to kill Lisa with help from his foster child. But that's not all. He's also accused of sexual battery for having a relationship with that child.
The charges were conspiracy to commit aggravated murder, complicity to commit aggravated murder, and there was multiple sexual battery charges.
Sabrina explained later that she turned against Kevin because she felt abandoned by Kevin, who promised to take care of her after the murders. She believed her life was going to be better after Lisa was out of the picture, but ultimately being in jail on these charges and feeling abandoned by Kevin for not protecting her, she decided to speak up.
We have a 44-year-old man with no prior criminal record, no prior criminal history. But we also have a 41-year-old woman who was a mother to 2, a sister to 1, and a wife who was brutally murdered.
In my opinion, the verdict came very quickly. The jury came up with a guilty verdict. I believe it took a matter of about 2 days.
We're satisfied that the likelihood that he's ever going to get out is slim and none by the terms of this sentence.
He's looking to appeal. Do you think that'll be successful?
No.
It felt very gratifying to me for the long work and hard work that myself, our police department, and our prosecutor team have put into this case. Kevin Knafel is a sexual predator. He was no better than the people that sexually abused the kids that Lisa was trying to help.
And you stabbed her, you caught her, as I understand it, is that correct?
Yes, Your Honor.
On multiple occasions, correct?
Yes, Your Honor.
And you caused her death, is that what you're telling us here today? Are you in fact guilty of another crime of aggravated murder based upon your acknowledgments and representations here in court today, that charge being outlined in the indictment?
Yes, Your Honor.
Sabrina Zunich has been sentenced to 30 years in prison for stabbing her foster mother, Lisa Knaufel, to death earlier this year. Police said Zunich was involved in a love affair with her stepfather. She pleaded guilty to a count of aggravated murder. Her sentence does carry the possibility of parole.
Sabrina Zunich was given a 30-year sentence, and that's when she would be eligible for parole. So she could do more time. Kind of depends on her behavior while she is currently in prison.
Based on Sabrina's upbringing and based on Kevin's grooming, it kind of felt to me like she didn't have control over this, because I don't think she learned right from wrong from the people, the adults in her life.
I feel bad for Sabrina because I think she's also a victim in this case, even though she's the main suspect in this case. But I feel bad that she was taken advantage of by a grown adult that should know better.
When you think back to the type of person Lisa is, it just makes it that much worse to have your life taken by somebody that you reached out to help. Is unfathomable to think about.
When a person dies, it has a ripple effect on everybody. It causes so much pain for their children, for the people who love Lisa, for the kids who will no longer be helped because Lisa's not here. It causes so much pain when somebody like that dies.
The afternoon light in Delphi, Indiana on February 13, 2017, looked almost ordinary in a way that later made everything feel worse. The sky was a pale winter gray, the kind that doesn't quite promise snow, but refuses to give you warmth. Trees along the Monon High Bridge Trail stood bare and skeletal, their branches tracing thin lines against the dull horizon. The Wabash River moved slowly beneath the old railroad bridge, its surface broken only by the occasional ripple of wind. It was a day that should have disappeared into memory without incident. But it didn't. Somewhere on that quiet trail, two young girls were walking into a moment that would fracture an entire community for years to come. Liberty German was 14. Friends called her Libby. She had that restless kind of energy that didn't fit neatly into school hallways or quiet afternoons. She liked taking pictures, short videos, capturing moments most people would let slip by without noticing. There was something observant about her, something that made her linger just a second longer on the world than others did. Abigail Williams was 13. Abby was gentler in presence, more reserved, but deeply connected to the people she loved. She and Libby were close in that effortless way childhood friendships sometimes are, built on shared laughter, inside jokes, and the unspoken trust that comes from growing up side by side in a small town where nothing ever felt truly out of reach. That afternoon, they were simply out walking. No one thought much of it. In a town like Delphi, teenagers walking a trail wasn't unusual. The Monon High Bridge Trail was a familiar place, a repurposed railway path where locals came to walk dogs, take photos, or just pass time when the world felt too small indoors. But something about that day would make it different. Libby's phone was in her pocket. And she was recording. At first, it was just another casual moment, the kind teenagers capture without thinking. But that small decision, that instinct to press record, would become the most important piece of evidence in a case that would haunt investigators for years. As the girls moved deeper along the trail, they approached the Monon High Bridge. It was an old structure, weathered and narrow, made of iron and wooden ties that creaked underfoot. It stretched across a wide span of empty air, high above the frozen creek below. Walking it required balance and a bit of courage, the kind of thrill that makes teenagers feel briefly invincible. They didn't know they were being watched. Somewhere behind them, a figure was closing in. What happened next would never be fully seen, only partially captured. A short video clip. A grainy image. A man walking along the bridge behind them, his hands in his pockets, his posture calm but deliberate. The camera picked him up in fragments, enough to know he was there, not enough to fully understand him. But there was something in the way he moved that didn't belong. Not in the casual rhythm of a passerby. More like someone who had already decided something. Then came the voice recording. It wasn't clear at first. Wind interference. Footsteps on old wood. The faint rustle of movement in a place where sound carries strangely. But beneath it, a male voice. Low. Controlled. Close enough that it didn't feel like an echo, but like something spoken directly into the space between them. Words that would later be interpreted as an order. Down the hill. That was all it took to turn an ordinary afternoon into something else entirely. After that moment, the trail went silent in a way that no recording could fully explain. The girls did not return. And by evening, when families began to worry, the absence of their presence became impossible to ignore. Calls went unanswered. Messages unread. What began as concern slowly sharpened into fear, the kind that tightens in the chest and refuses to loosen no matter how many times you try to convince yourself it's nothing. As night fell over Delphi, searchers gathered. Flashlights cut through the darkness along the Monon High Bridge trail. Volunteers, police officers, neighbors who had come without needing to be asked. The town, usually quiet and predictable, became something else entirely. A place moving with urgency, voices calling names into the cold air, footsteps breaking through frozen grass. Libby and Abby were not found that night. The next day, the search expanded. And then, just beyond the familiar paths, in a wooded area not far from the creek, the search ended in a way no one wanted. 2 bodies. Side by side. Stillness where there should have been life. The discovery did not come with noise or spectacle. It came with a kind of heavy silence that spreads through groups of people without anyone needing to speak it aloud. Searchers stopped moving. Radios went quiet. Even the wind seemed to hesitate. Delphi, a town of barely 3,000 people, had just become the center of a national nightmare. In the hours that followed, everything began to change shape. The trail that had once been a place for walks and photographs became a sealed-off investigation zone. Yellow tape stretched between trees. Officers moved carefully through the underbrush, marking the ground, photographing everything, treating every leaf and footprint as if it might hold the answer to a question no one yet knew how to ask correctly. And somewhere within that space, investigators knew something critical had already been captured. A video. A voice. A man on a bridge who had walked too close to 2 girls who should have made it home. In the early days of the investigation, hope and uncertainty moved together. Authorities released fragments of information, asking for help from the public, believing that someone would recognize the figure caught on Libby's phone. The image of the so-called bridge guy circulated widely, becoming one of the most haunting visual mysteries in modern true crime history. A man walking forward. Head slightly lowered. Hands in pockets. As if he belonged there. As if nothing unusual was happening at all. But no name came forward. No immediate answer revealed itself. Instead, what followed was something more complicated. Years of uncertainty. Shifting theories. False leads that pulled investigators in different directions. Sketches of suspects that changed over time, each one briefly carrying the weight of possibility before being set aside. The case became a constant presence in Delphi, like a shadow that refused to move on. For the families of Libby and Abby, time did not soften anything. It only stretched the moment of loss into something longer, heavier. Every unanswered question became its own kind of burden. Every quiet day without resolution added another layer of absence. And still, the image of that man on the bridge remained. Unchanging. Watching without expression. Walking without explanation. In the years that followed, investigators would return to that video again and again. They would study the movement, the timing, the sound. They would replay the voice, searching for inflection, hesitation, anything that might reveal intention. They would ask whether the calmness was deception or confidence, whether the person they were looking for was a stranger or someone hiding in plain sight. Because one thing was becoming increasingly clear. This was not a random act of violence in the way people first hoped it might be. It felt deliberate. Localized. Close. Too close. And that realization changed everything about how the case was approached, even when answers refused to appear. Delphi itself began to feel different after the murders. Residents spoke more carefully. Parents watched their children more closely. The Monon High Bridge Trail, once a simple recreational path, became a place layered with unspoken memory. Even years later, walking near it carried a weight that visitors could feel without knowing why. Something had happened there. Something that had not been resolved. And somewhere, the person responsible had remained unseen. Until, years later, the silence finally began to break. But in February 2017, none of that was known yet. At that moment, all anyone had was a trail, a recording, and two girls who had stepped into a winter afternoon and never returned from it. The question that would define the next 5 years had already been formed, even if no one yet knew how to answer it. Who was the man on the bridge? And why did he follow them into the woods? Delphi, Indiana, is the kind of place that does not announce itself to the world. It does not sit along major highways of attention, or demand to be remembered. It exists quietly in the middle stretch of the American Midwest, surrounded by farmland that changes color with the seasons in slow, predictable cycles. In spring, the fields soften into green. In summer, they stretch wide and golden under heat that hums in the distance. In autumn, everything turns copper and rust. And in winter, like the time when everything began, the land becomes stripped down to its bare structure, honest and exposed. It is a town where people know each other by sight, before they know each other by name. Where a stranger walking into a diner is noticed not with suspicion, but with curiosity that quickly becomes conversation. Where life moves at a pace shaped more by habit than urgency. On the surface, nothing about Delphi suggested it would become the center of one of the most haunting criminal cases in modern American memory. And yet it did. To understand how that happened, you have to understand the geography of the place itself, because in Delphi, landscape and life are tightly interwoven. The Monon High Bridge Trail, where the story would eventually converge, is not an isolated wilderness. It is a repurposed piece of history, a former railroad line converted into a walking path. It runs through trees and over small valleys, cutting a narrow corridor of human presence through an otherwise natural environment. The bridge itself, known locally as the Monon High Bridge, is a relic from another era. Built decades ago for trains that no longer run, it stands elevated above Deer Creek, its iron frame weathered by time and weather. The wooden planks that form its walkway are uneven in places, some worn smoother than others by years of footsteps. There are no railings on the sides, only open air and a long drop to the water below. From a distance, it looks peaceful. Almost picturesque. But when you are on it, the feeling changes. The bridge narrows your attention. Each step becomes intentional. The space around you feels both open and constricted at the same time, as if the structure is asking you to respect its history, while also reminding you of its fragility. Wind moves more freely there. Sound travels differently. Even silence feels louder. Locals knew the trail well. It was not considered dangerous in the traditional sense. Families walked it. Joggers used it. Teenagers treated it as a place of exploration, a space where independence could be tested without leaving the boundaries of town. For Liberty German and Abigail Williams, it was familiar territory. A place where curiosity felt safe enough to follow. That sense of safety is important to understand, because Delphi did not live with constant fear. It was not a town shaped by frequent violent crime or visible threat. People locked their doors, but not with the expectation that something would happen. They did so out of habit, out of inherited caution, not immediate concern. This is what makes places like Delphi particularly vulnerable in ways that are difficult to recognize until after something has gone wrong. Trust is embedded into the structure of daily life. You expect that people around you are who they appear to be. You expect that familiar paths remain safe, because they have always been safe before. The Monon High Bridge Trail existed within that expectation. It was the kind of place where parents allowed a bit of freedom. Where teenagers could walk without constant supervision. Where the idea of danger felt abstract, something that happened elsewhere, in larger cities or distant headlines. On February 13, 2017, that assumption held, at least at the beginning of the day. The weather that winter had been inconsistent. Indiana winters often are. Some days brought sharp cold that cut through jackets. Others softened unexpectedly, melting snow into damp earth and turning trails into a mix of mud and frozen patches. That particular day sat somewhere in between, not severe enough to discourage outdoor activity, not warm enough to feel inviting. It was the kind of weather that makes people underestimate time outside. The Monon High Bridge Trail itself runs through sections of wooded land that shift gradually between openness and enclosure. In some places, the trees pull back and allow sunlight to spread across the path. In others, they close in tightly, forming tunnels of branches that filter light into thin, fractured patterns on the ground. In winter, those patterns are sharper. There are no leaves to soften the outlines, no green to fill the empty spaces. Everything is structure and shadow. Walking there in February means walking through a landscape that feels honest in a stripped-down way. You hear your own movement more clearly. You notice distances differently. You become aware of how far sound can travel, when there is nothing to absorb it. The bridge itself sits deeper into this environment, accessible only by following the trail far enough that civilization begins to feel slightly removed. Even so, it is not truly isolated. It is reachable, known, mapped, visited. That duality matters. It is not a hidden place. It is a place that becomes hidden by attention, or lack of it. For the residents of Delphi, the trail was part of the background of life. It was not discussed often, because it did not require discussion. It simply existed, like the school, the grocery store, the courthouse square. A fixed point in the layout of the town. Children grew up knowing it as a place for small adventures. Adults remembered it as something slightly more nostalgic, tied to memories of earlier versions of themselves walking similar paths, perhaps without phones, perhaps without cameras, but with the same sense of temporary freedom. The land itself holds memory in a quiet way. The bridge has stood through decades of seasonal change. It has seen generations pass across it, each leaving nothing visible behind except the subtle wear of time on wood and iron. By 2017, the trail had become even more accessible to the public, maintained as a recreational space. It carried signage, maps, and informal expectations of behavior that relied more on community understanding than enforcement. There were no gates controlling entry, no strict oversight of movement. You entered when you wished, and you left when you chose. That openness is part of what made it appealing. It is also part of what made it vulnerable. On the outskirts of the trail system, the town of Delphi itself continued its routine existence. Schools operated on schedule. Shops opened in the morning and closed in the evening. Conversations at diners revolved around local events, sports games, weather predictions, and the usual rhythm of small-town life. Nothing in the days leading up to February 13th suggested disruption was approaching. There were no obvious warnings, no public alerts shaping behavior, no visible tension in the community atmosphere. And yet, beneath that normality, the structure of the environment remained unchanged. The same paths. The same bridge. The same quiet spaces between trees where visibility narrows and sound becomes uncertain. This combination of familiarity and openness is what defines places like the Monon High Bridge Trail. It is accessible enough to feel safe, but removed enough to create moments where isolation can briefly exist. Those moments are usually harmless. Most days, nothing happens at all. But landscapes do not change simply because people feel comfortable within them. They remain what they are, physical spaces with their own geometry, their own blind spots, their own quiet distances. On that February afternoon, all of those elements existed exactly as they always had. The bridge stood. The trail extended through the woods. The creek flowed beneath. The town continued unaware. It is easy, after the fact, to imagine places as holding warning signs, as if the environment itself could have spoken. But Delphi did not change before the tragedy. It only revealed what had always been present, but not fully considered. The stillness of winter trees. The narrowing of a bridge with no barriers. The way sound travels when there is nothing to catch it. The way a path can feel both open and isolated depending on how far you are from others. These are not extraordinary features. They are ordinary ones. Which is precisely what makes them significant in hindsight. In February 2017, the Monon High Bridge Trail remained what it had always been, a space for walking, exploring, and passing time. A place where life in Delphi extended outward into nature, and then returned again. It did not carry warning signs in any obvious way. It did not announce what would happen there. It simply existed, as it always had, under a winter sky that gave no indication that this particular day would become something that people would remember long after the season itself had passed. To understand what was lost in Delphi, you have to slow down and look closely at two lives that were still in the process of becoming their own stories. Not finished. Not defined by tragedy. But interrupted in the middle, where childhood still overlaps with the first signs of adulthood, and everything feels both familiar and new at the same time. Liberty German, known to most people as Libby, was 14 years old. At that age, she was already beginning to develop a sense of who she was, though like many teenagers, she was still testing the edges of it. She had a presence that people noticed, not because she tried to stand out, but because she naturally engaged with the world around her. There was a curiosity in her that did not feel passive. She did not just observe life, she interacted with it, recorded it, shaped it into something she could return to later. She liked photography and short videos, not in a professional sense, but in the instinctive way that young people today capture moments as they happen. A laugh between friends. A reflection in a window. A passing expression that might otherwise disappear unnoticed. Her phone was not just a device. It was a way of holding on to time, of making moments last longer than they were meant to. Those who knew her described her as expressive and energetic. She could be loud in the way that confidence sometimes arrives before adulthood has fully formed it. She cared about people in an immediate, visible way. When she was present completely. There was little distance between what she felt and how she showed it. Abigail Williams, Abby, was 13. She was quieter in comparison, but not absent. Her presence was softer, more reflective. She observed more than she spoke, but when she did speak, it carried weight among those who knew her. She had a gentleness that made people feel at ease around her, as if she did not demand attention, but welcomed it when it came. Abby and Libby were friends in a way that did not require constant explanation. They were connected through shared time, shared environments, shared experiences that only make sense in the world of early adolescence. They attended school in the same small community. They spent time together outside of structured environments where rules are less formal and friendships are shaped more by instinct than planning. Their bond was built in the ordinary spaces of growing up. Hallways between classes. Conversations that continued after school. Moments of laughter that seemed unimportant at the time, but become defining in memory. They were not defined by their individual differences, although those differences were real. Instead, they balanced each other in a way that often happens in close friendships at that age. One more outward, one more inward. One more expressive, one more reflective. Together, they formed a kind of equilibrium that made their time together feel natural. On the surface, their lives were typical for their age group in a small Midwestern town. School, family, friends, routines that repeated weekly with slight variations. There was nothing in their daily existence that suggested anything out of the ordinary was waiting ahead. That is what makes the loss harder to comprehend. There was no visible disruption in the structure of their lives before that afternoon. No warning embedded in their routines. No fracture in their normal world that would suggest an approaching break. Libby lived in a home filled with family connections, where relationships were active and involved. She was part of a household where communication mattered, where her presence was noticed and expected. Abby also lived within a network of family care and attention, surrounded by people who were engaged in her life and her development. In both cases, they were not isolated children. They were connected, supported, present within families who expected them to return home. That expectation is important, because it frames what was later lost. This was not a disappearance that occurred in silence without immediate awareness. It was noticed quickly. It was responded to. Concern began almost immediately when the girls did not return as expected. The transition from normal afternoon to concern was not gradual. It was relatively fast. Messages were checked. Calls were made. Plans were reviewed. At first, there is always an assumption that something explainable has occurred. A delay. A change of plan. A misunderstanding of timing. But as time passed, that assumption began to weaken. Libby's personality, in particular, makes that shift more noticeable in hindsight. She was not someone who would easily disappear from communication without reason. She was active on her phone, engaged with social interaction, present in ways that made her absence more visible when it occurred. Abby's presence was similarly anchored in routine and connection. Her absence did not fit the pattern of her normal behavior either. It is difficult to describe what it feels like when a small uncertainty begins to form in a family. It is not immediate panic. It is something slower, more internal. A quiet recalculation of possibilities. A growing sense that the expected timeline of events is no longer matching reality. By the time evening arrived on February 13th, that uncertainty had shifted into something more serious. The world of Libby and Abby at that moment was still suspended in unknown space. They were no longer visible to the people waiting for them, but their absence had not yet been explained. That in-between state is often the most difficult part of any missing person situation. It exists between belief and knowledge, between hope and fear. In cases like this, families often replay the last known details repeatedly. Where they were supposed to be. What time they left. Who they were with. What was said in the final communication? These details become anchors, points of reference in a rapidly changing emotional landscape. Libby and Abby were last known to be at the Monon High Bridge Trail, a place familiar enough that it did not initially raise concern. It was not unusual for teenagers in Delphi to spend time in outdoor spaces like this. That familiarity delayed the sense that something was wrong, because nothing about the location itself suggested immediate danger. But familiarity can sometimes delay recognition of risk. As daylight faded, the absence became more difficult to ignore. What had started as a delay became a missing presence. What had begun as uncertainty became fear. For families, those hours are often the most psychologically intense. Every passing moment without contact changes the emotional weight of the situation. Hope and anxiety begin to overlap, making it difficult to separate what is likely from what is feared. Friends, relatives, and community members begin to join in the search for answers. Phones are checked repeatedly. Messages are sent even when there is no expectation of response, because not sending them feels worse than sending them into silence. Libby and Abby were not just names in a news report at that stage. They were daughters, friends, classmates, and familiar faces within a small community where relationships are closely woven. The emotional impact of their absence spread quickly through Delphi once concern became shared knowledge. In small towns, information does not remain contained for long. People know each other, and news moves through informal networks as quickly as official channels. What made the situation particularly painful was the uncertainty of it. There was no immediate explanation. No confirmed accident. No verified location beyond the last known trail. That lack of clarity leaves space for imagination, and imagination, in such circumstances, often leans toward fear. Even before any discovery was made, the absence of Libby and Abby had already begun to reshape the emotional atmosphere of those closest to them. It is important to understand them not only as victims of a later crime, but as individuals whose lives were active, connected, and meaningful before that moment. They were not defined by what happened to them, but by who they were in the time leading up to it. Libby's tendency to record the world around her would later become one of the most discussed aspects of the case, but in life it was simply part of how she experienced moments. Abby's quieter nature was often the balance to that energy, creating a friendship that worked through contrast as much as similarity. They were at an age where identity is still forming, where friendships carry significant emotional weight, and where everyday experiences often feel larger than they will later appear in memory. That afternoon on the trail, they were simply two friends spending time together in a place they knew. There is nothing unusual in that fact by itself. What transforms it into something else is what followed afterward, when contact stopped and the expected return never came. Before any investigation began, before any evidence was analyzed, before any narrative was constructed around events, there were simply two missing teenagers, and a growing sense of concern within a community that did not yet know how serious the situation would become. Libby and Abby existed, in that moment, in the space between normal life and unimaginable outcome. And it is within that space that their story begins, not as a crime, but as two lives interrupted while still very much in motion. The trail did not change when Libby and Abby stepped onto it that afternoon. The wooden planks of the Monon High Bridge remained uneven, spaced just far enough apart to require careful footing. The trees stood as they had all winter, stripped of leaves, their branches forming a jagged canopy that filtered the pale light into fractured shadows. The creek below moved quietly, its surface reflecting a sky that offered no hint of what was about to unfold above it. For the girls, the walk began like any other. There was no urgency in their steps, no tension in their voices. They moved forward with the kind of casual rhythm that comes from familiarity, from having walked similar paths before. Conversations drifted in and out, sometimes spoken, sometimes replaced by the quiet understanding that exists between close friends. The air carried that faint winter chill, enough to redden fingers and cheeks, but not enough to drive them back home. Libby had her phone out at intervals, capturing moments the way she often did. Not with any grand intention, just small fragments of time preserved without much thought about what they might mean later. Abby appeared in some of those frames, relaxed, present, unaware that these would become the last images of her alive. The bridge itself marked a transition point. Stepping onto it always required a shift in attention. The ground beneath became less forgiving. Each step had to be placed carefully on the wooden ties. The absence of railings meant that balance mattered. Even those who had crossed it many times still felt that slight tightening in the body when they first stepped onto its narrow span. Libby and Abby moved forward onto the bridge. From that vantage point, the world opens and narrows at the same time. You can see farther in distance, but your path is confined to a straight line. There is no easy way off except to continue forward or turn back. It creates a kind of temporary isolation, even in a place that is not truly remote. It was somewhere along this stretch that the presence behind them began to take shape. At first, it may have been nothing more than awareness. A sound that didn't quite match their own movement. The faint echo of footsteps carried differently across wood than dirt. A shift in rhythm that suggested someone else was on the bridge. They did not run. They did not immediately react in a way that would suggest panic. Instead, Libby raised her phone again. The video she recorded is brief, fragmented, but it captures something critical. A man walking toward them from behind. His figure is partially obscured by distance and motion, but his presence is unmistakable. He is dressed in a jacket, hands in his pockets, moving with a steady, deliberate pace. There is no visible rush in his steps. No outward sign of urgency. And yet, there is something in the way he moves that does not align with the casual nature of the setting. It is not overtly aggressive, but it is not entirely neutral either. It sits somewhere in between, in a space that is difficult to define, but easy to feel. Libby keeps recording. It is an instinctive act, one that would later become one of the most important decisions made in those final moments. Whether she felt something was wrong or simply wanted to capture a passing moment is something no one can say with certainty. But the camera remains focused long enough to document his approach. The distance between them closes. The bridge offers no easy exit. There is no quick path off to the side, no immediate way to separate from someone walking directly toward you. Movement becomes constrained by the structure itself. You are either moving forward, or you are not moving at all. At some point, the interaction shifts. The video ends before the most critical moments occur, but another piece remains. Audio. The recording captures a voice. Male. Calm. Controlled. The words are simple, but they carry weight. An instruction. Down the hill. There is no shouting. No raised tone. No visible struggle within the audio itself. The voice does not need to be loud to be authoritative. It is delivered with a level of certainty that removes ambiguity from the situation. In that moment, whatever sense of normalcy remained on the bridge disappears. What follows is not fully captured. There is no complete recording of movement off the bridge. No clear visual account of what happens next. The details become fragmented, reconstructed later through investigation, evidence, and inference rather than direct observation. But the direction is clear. Off the bridge. Down the hill. Away from the open structure, and into the more enclosed environment below. The terrain shifts quickly in that area. The descent from the bridge leads into uneven ground, patches of brush, and the edge of Deer Creek. The visibility decreases as the landscape becomes more layered with trees and natural obstacles. Sound behaves differently there, absorbed in some directions, amplified in others. It is a place where movement can become less visible from a distance. Less noticeable. What happened in those next moments exists in a space between known fact and inferred sequence. Investigators would later work to piece together the path taken, the location where events unfolded, the physical evidence left behind. But in the immediate sense, what matters is the transition. From open to enclosed. From visible to hidden. From casual encounter to controlled situation. The girls are no longer simply walking a trail. They are being directed. That shift is critical. It marks the point where agency changes, where the balance of control moves away from them and into the hands of someone else. There are no witnesses who fully observed what followed. No one present to interrupt. No immediate intervention. The trail, which had earlier felt open and accessible, becomes something else in that moment. A place where distance and timing create a gap wide enough for something to happen without being immediately seen. The winter environment adds to that effect. The lack of leaves creates visibility in some directions, but the uneven terrain and natural structures still provide concealment in others. The cold air carries sound differently, but it also disperses it across distances that may not connect to anyone close enough to recognize its significance. Time moves differently in such moments. What may have lasted minutes would later stretch into years of investigation and unanswered questions. Every second of that encounter would be examined, replayed, analyzed for meaning. But in the moment itself, it unfolds without that perspective. There is no sense of narrative. No awareness of future consequence. Only the immediate reality of the situation as it develops. At some point after leaving the bridge, the encounter escalates into violence. The exact sequence of actions is not fully public, and certain details remain withheld to preserve the integrity of the investigation and respect for the victims. What is known is the outcome. The girls are killed. Their lives end not far from the place where they were last seen, within the same environment that had felt familiar only a short time earlier. The contrast between those two states is difficult to process. The same trail, the same trees, the same bridge. Nothing in the physical environment changes, and yet everything about its meaning shifts in an instant. After the act, the area returns to stillness. There is no immediate alarm triggered by the event itself. No visible sign from a distance that something has occurred. The trail remains open. The bridge stands unchanged. The creek continues its slow movement beneath. It is only through absence that the event begins to reveal itself. The girls do not return. The expected timeline breaks. Concern grows. Search efforts begin. But in those first hours after the incident, the location holds its silence. It does not announce what has happened. It does not provide immediate answers. It simply contains the aftermath, waiting to be discovered by those who will come looking. What makes this part of the story particularly haunting is how quickly normalcy gave way to something irreversible. There was no prolonged lead-up, no visible escalation that others could observe and intervene in. It was a moment that formed and closed within a narrow window of time, leaving behind only fragments of evidence and a series of questions that would take years to begin answering. The video remains. The voice remains. The image of a man walking on a bridge remains. Everything else becomes reconstruction. And it all begins with that simple transition from an ordinary walk to an encounter that should never have happened, on a bridge that offered no escape once the distance between them had closed. By the time the search began in earnest, the daylight was already thinning, stretching into that uncertain gray that comes just before evening fully takes hold. In Delphi, The shift from afternoon to night is not dramatic, but gradual, almost deceptive. One moment you believe there is still time, and the next, the landscape begins to flatten into shadow. At first, the concern had been contained within family. Calls placed, messages sent, small attempts to re-establish contact. There is always that initial belief that there must be a simple explanation, something that will resolve itself with a returned call, or a sudden reappearance. But as minutes passed and turned into hours, that belief began to erode. Libby and Abby were not where they were supposed to be. And they were not responding. The decision to begin searching came quickly after that realization settled in. Family members reached out to friends, to neighbors, to anyone who might have seen the girls or knew where they could be. In a town like Delphi, people do not wait for formal organization when something feels wrong. They move. They gather. They help. By late afternoon, small groups had already begun to head toward the Monon High Bridge Trail. The search did not begin with structure. It began with urgency. People walked the paths calling out names, their voices carrying through the trees in uneven waves. Libby. Abby. Each call stretched into the distance, met only by the dull echo of its own return. The cold air sharpened those sounds, making them feel louder than they were, but also more fragile, as if they could disappear just as easily. As more people arrived, the search expanded outward. Flashlights were brought out even before full darkness settled, their beams cutting through the growing dimness. The ground was uneven in places, still holding patches of dampness from earlier weather. Footsteps left marks that blurred quickly, making it difficult to distinguish one track from another. The bridge itself was checked early on. Searchers moved across it carefully, some calling out, others scanning the area below. There was no immediate sign of struggle visible from that vantage point. No obvious indication that something violent had occurred. Just the same structure, the same wooden iron, unchanged from the last time it had been crossed. It gave nothing away. As night fell, the temperature dropped further. The kind of cold that settles into clothing and makes movement slower over time. Still, people continued searching. Parents, relatives, volunteers, law enforcement. The distinction between official and unofficial blurred in those early hours, replaced by a shared objective that overrode normal boundaries. Find the girls. Bring them home. That night stretched long, measured not in hours but in repeated actions. Walking. Calling. Listening. Hoping for any sign that would break the growing tension. Every sound became significant. A branch snapping underfoot. The rustle of wind through dry leaves. The distant movement of water. Each one raised the possibility of something more, only to collapse back into uncertainty. There is a particular kind of silence that develops during searches like this. It is not the absence of sound, but the absence of response. Voices go out, but nothing comes back. That imbalance begins to weigh on those involved, pressing against the edges of hope. By late night, it became clear that the search would not end quickly. Authorities became more formally involved as the situation escalated. Law enforcement began coordinating efforts, attempting to organize the growing number of volunteers into something more structured. Areas were divided. Paths were assigned. The randomness of the initial search began to shift toward method. But even with that structure, the outcome remained the same. No sign of Libby or Abby. At some point, the decision was made to pause the search overnight, at least in terms of large-scale volunteer activity. The terrain was difficult, the darkness limiting visibility in ways that made continued searching less effective and potentially dangerous for those involved. It was not a decision made easily. Stopping meant leaving the girls out there somewhere, unseen, unlocated, and that thought settled heavily over everyone connected to the search. But exhaustion, visibility, and safety forced a pause that no one wanted. The night passed slowly. For the families, it was not rest. It was waiting. The kind of waiting that stretches time into something almost unrecognizable. Every hour feels longer than it should. Every possibility is considered and reconsidered. Hope rises and falls in uneven patterns, never settling into anything stable. Morning came without resolution. And with it, the search resumed. This time, it was larger. More organized. More urgent. Additional law enforcement agencies became involved. Search teams expanded their coverage. The wooded areas surrounding the trail were examined more thoroughly, moving beyond the main paths into less accessible terrain. Volunteers returned, despite fatigue, drawn by the same need to find answers. The environment looked different in daylight. What had been shadowed and uncertain the night before was now visible in full detail. The uneven ground, the slopes leading down from the bridge, the scattered brush and tree lines. It all appeared clearer, but clarity did not immediately translate into answers. Searchers moved in lines now, scanning the ground systematically. Eyes trained to notice anything out of place. A piece of clothing. A disturbed patch of earth. Any sign that would indicate where the girls had gone. It did not take long for something to be found. Not on the bridge. Not directly on the main trail. But nearby. In a wooded area not far from Deer Creek. The discovery did not come with warning. It came with a sudden shift in movement. A break in the rhythm of the search. Someone stopping. Others gathering. The kind of subtle change that signals something significant has occurred even before words are spoken. Then confirmation. 2 bodies. The moment of realization spread quickly through those present, not through loud announcement, but through reaction. People stopped speaking. Movements slowed. The urgency that had driven the search transformed into something heavier, more controlled. There is no preparation for that transition. One moment, you are searching for missing girls. The next, you are standing in the presence of what you hoped you would not find. Law enforcement moved to secure the area almost immediately. The space that had just been part of an active search became a crime scene. Boundaries were established. Access was restricted. What had been open to volunteers hours earlier was now carefully controlled. The bodies were located close enough to the trail that they remained within the same general environment, yet far enough removed to have gone unnoticed during the initial search. That detail would later become significant, raising questions about timing, visibility, and how something so critical could remain hidden in a place that had already been examined. But in that moment, analysis had not yet begun. There was only the weight of confirmation. Libby and Abby were not missing anymore. They were gone. The emotional shift that followed is difficult to quantify. For families, the uncertainty that had filled the previous hours was replaced by a different kind of reality. One that removed hope of a safe return, but introduced a new set of questions that were just as overwhelming. For the community, the impact spread quickly. Delphi, which had spent the previous day searching, now had to confront the fact that something violent had occurred within its boundaries. Something that had taken 2 lives in a place that had felt safe. Investigators began their work almost immediately. The area was examined in detail. Every visible element was documented. The ground, the surrounding vegetation, the positioning of the bodies. Evidence was collected with care, each piece treated as potentially critical. The process was methodical, deliberate. There was no rushing it. Because within that space lay the only physical answers to what had happened. The bridge, the trail, the wooded area, all became part of a larger investigation that would extend far beyond that day. What had once been a simple recreational path was now a location of forensic significance, its details analyzed in ways no one had previously imagined. As the scene was processed, the initial fragments of understanding began to form. This was not an accident. It was not a situation that could be explained by misadventure or natural causes. It was intentional, deliberate, violent. And somewhere, the person responsible was not there. They had left, leaving behind only evidence, fragments of action, and the beginning of a case that would challenge investigators for years. The discovery marked the end of the search. But it also marked the beginning of something else. An investigation that would grow in complexity. A question that would not be answered quickly. And a silence that would settle over Delphi, heavier than before, because now it was filled not with uncertainty, but with knowledge that something had been taken, and no one yet knew how to find the one who had taken it. In the days that followed the discovery, Delphi no longer felt like the same town. The physical landscape had not changed, but the way people moved through it had. Conversations lowered in tone. Eye contact lingered longer than usual. Ordinary routines continued, but they carried a different weight, as if everyone was quietly aware that something unseen had entered their world and had not yet left. The investigation began with intensity. Law enforcement agencies at the local, state, and federal levels became involved, each bringing resources, personnel, and their own methods of approaching a case that had already begun to draw national attention. The wooded area near Deer Creek, once part of an informal trail system, was now transformed into a controlled crime scene. Access was restricted. Movement was documented. Every inch of ground was treated as if it might contain something that could lead to an answer. The first stage of any investigation like this is about establishing what is known. 2 victims. A general timeline. A last known location. A potential suspect captured, however briefly, on video and audio. That last element changed everything. Libby's phone had preserved something rare in cases like this. A visual and auditory trace of a person who was present at the critical moment. The image of the man on the bridge, and the short clip of his voice became the central focus of the investigation, almost immediately. It offered both hope and frustration in equal measure. Hope, because there was something tangible to work with. Frustration, because what it revealed was incomplete. The video was analyzed repeatedly. Frame by frame. Investigators studied the man's posture, the way he walked, the angle of his head, the clothing he wore. They examined the grain of the image, trying to enhance details that were not clearly visible at first glance. Every movement was considered. Every shadow questioned. The audio received the same level of scrutiny. The voice, calm and controlled, was isolated and replayed. Specialists listened for patterns in speech, regional accents, subtle inflections that might indicate age, background, or emotional state. The phrase itself was simple, but simplicity does not make identification easier. It only reduces the amount of information available to analyze. Despite these limitations, the decision was made to release parts of the video and audio to the public. The reasoning was straightforward. Someone, somewhere, might recognize the man. In a small town like Delphi, that possibility carried weight. The idea that the person responsible could be known to someone in the community, seen in passing, recognized from daily life, was both hopeful and deeply unsettling. The image of the man, soon referred to as the bridge guy, spread quickly. It appeared on news broadcasts, social media, posters, and public announcements. The still frame showed a figure that was both specific and ambiguous at the same time. A man in a jacket, walking forward, his face partially obscured, his identity hidden behind low resolution and limited perspective. People began to look more closely at those around them. Neighbors, co-workers, strangers passing through town. Anyone who might resemble the figure on the bridge. Tips started coming in almost immediately. At first, they arrived in manageable numbers. A few calls, a few names, a few observations from people who believed they had seen something relevant. But as the case gained attention, the volume increased dramatically. Hundreds of tips. Then thousands. Each one had to be documented, reviewed, and either pursued or dismissed. The process was time-consuming and often repetitive. Many tips led nowhere. Some pointed to individuals who bore a resemblance to the image, but had no connection to the case. Others were based on vague impressions, influenced more by fear than by concrete evidence. Investigators worked through them methodically. There was no shortcut. Every possibility had to be considered, because missing the right lead could mean losing the only chance at identifying the person responsible. At the same time, forensic analysis continued. Evidence collected from the crime scene was processed, catalogued, and examined for any trace that could link a suspect to the location. This included physical materials, biological samples, and any other elements that might provide insight into what had occurred. But forensic evidence does not always produce immediate answers. Sometimes it confirms details without revealing identity. Sometimes it narrows possibilities without eliminating uncertainty. In this case, it added layers to the investigation without resolving its central question. Who was the man on the bridge? As weeks turned into months, the investigation entered a different phase. The initial urgency remained, but it was now accompanied by the slow, deliberate pace of long-term casework. Detectives revisited interviews, re-examined timelines, and reanalyzed evidence. The same questions were asked again and again, not because they had been answered, but because the answers had not yet been found. One of the most challenging aspects of the case was the absence of a clear suspect. There were individuals who drew attention. People who seemed to fit certain aspects of the profile. Men who lived nearby, who had access to the trail, who matched the general description captured in the video. But suspicion is not the same as evidence. And without evidence, there could be no arrest. At one point, law enforcement released a sketch of a potential suspect. It was based on witness descriptions and investigative interpretation. The image showed a man who could be recognized, someone whose face might trigger memory in those who saw it. But like the video, it was both helpful and limited. It provided a direction, but not a definitive answer. Later, a second sketch was released. This one appeared different, younger in appearance, with features that did not entirely align with the first. The release of a new sketch introduced confusion, as well as renewed attention. People began to question whether the investigation had shifted direction, whether the initial understanding of the suspect had been incomplete or incorrect. Law enforcement addressed this by emphasizing that the case was evolving. New information had emerged. Interpretations had changed. But from the outside, the effect was more complicated. The public wanted clarity. Instead, they received multiple possibilities. As time passed, the investigation encountered the kind of challenges that define unsolved cases. Leads that seemed promising at first would eventually collapse under scrutiny. Individuals who were briefly considered strong suspects would be ruled out. Patterns that appeared meaningful would dissolve when examined more closely. Each time this happened, the investigation did not move backward, but it did not move forward in any visible way either. It remained suspended. For the families of Libby and Abby, this period was particularly difficult. The initial shock of loss had given way to a prolonged state of waiting. Every update from law enforcement carried the possibility of resolution, but most updates did not provide it. Instead, they reinforced the reality that the case remained open, unresolved, and complex. The community of Delphi lived with this uncertainty as well. The image of the bridge guy did not fade. It remained present, a constant reminder that the person responsible had not been identified. People continued to look, to compare, to wonder. Trust, once taken for granted, became more conditional. Even in everyday interactions, there was a subtle shift. Questions formed quietly. Could it be someone known? Someone local? Someone who had been there all along? That possibility lingered in the background of daily life, never fully spoken, but rarely dismissed. As the years passed, the case became one of the most widely discussed unsolved crimes in the country. Podcasts covered it. Television programs revisited it. Online communities analyzed every available detail, constructing theories, comparing images, and debating interpretations. Some of these efforts brought attention and awareness. Others introduced speculation that complicated the investigation further. Law enforcement had to navigate both. They needed public assistance, but they also needed to protect the integrity of the case. Too much information could compromise future proceedings. Too little could reduce the chances of generating new leads. It was a balance that was never fully stable. Despite the passage of time, the core elements of the case remained unchanged. The video, the audio, the location, and the absence of a confirmed suspect. The investigation did not stop. It continued quietly, often out of public view, with detectives revisiting evidence, re-examining old leads, and exploring new ones as they emerged. Advances in technology offered some opportunities for reanalysis, but even those did not guarantee results. The case remained open, active, unresolved. And the question that had formed in the early days still stood, unchanged by time. Who was the man on the bridge? The answer existed somewhere, but it remained just out of reach, hidden within the layers of evidence, memory, and missed connections that defined the investigation during those long years when nothing seemed to move forward, even as everything continued underneath the surface. For years, the case moved in a way that felt almost invisible from the outside. There were updates, press conferences, occasional statements that hinted at progress, but nothing that clearly broke the silence surrounding the identity of the man on the bridge. To the public, it seemed as though the investigation had stalled, suspended in a state of unresolved tension that refused to release its answer. But beneath that surface, the work never stopped. Investigations like this do not always move forward in straight lines. They circle back. They revisit. They re-examine details that once seemed insignificant, searching for something that might have been overlooked not because it was hidden, but because it did not appear meaningful at the time. The breakthrough, when it finally came, did not arrive as a dramatic revelation pulled from a single piece of new evidence. It emerged slowly, through the careful reconstruction of information that had existed from the beginning. One of the most critical elements of the case had always been timeline. Who was on the trail that day? Who had been seen? Who had placed themselves in that environment at the time Libby and Abby were there? In the early stages of the investigation, many individuals had come forward voluntarily. Some had been identified through tips. Others had spoken to law enforcement simply because they knew they had been in the area and wanted to be transparent. Among them was a man who did not initially stand out. Richard Allen. He was a local resident. Someone who lived in Delphi. Someone who, on the surface, fit into the community in a way that did not draw attention. He worked, interacted with others, moved through daily life without raising immediate suspicion. And importantly, he had acknowledged something that would later become central. He had been on the trail that day. At the time, that detail did not trigger immediate alarm. Many people had been on the trail. It was not unusual. His statement placed him within a broader group of individuals who were present, but not necessarily connected to the crime. So his name was recorded. His information was filed. And like many others, it became part of the larger body of data collected during the investigation. Years passed. And that information remained. Not lost, but not fully activated either. The shift began when investigators returned to earlier records with a renewed focus. This is not uncommon in long-running cases. When new perspectives develop, or when previous approaches fail to produce results, investigators often go back to the beginning, looking at old information with fresh attention. What may have been dismissed before is reconsidered. What may have seemed ordinary is re-examined for hidden significance. In this process, Allen's earlier statement began to take on new weight. He had not only been on the trail. He had placed himself there at a time that aligned closely with the known timeline of the crime. That alone was not enough. But it was something. Investigators began to look more closely. They reviewed his original statement again, comparing it with other witness accounts, timelines, and physical evidence. They considered where he said he had been, how long he had stayed, what he had seen, and whether those details aligned with other information collected over the years. Patterns began to form. Subtle at first. Then more defined. The case had always contained a vast amount of information, but the challenge was connecting the right pieces in the right way. As investigators revisited these elements, they began to see points of intersection that had not been fully recognized before. At the same time, advancements in forensic analysis allowed for re-examination of physical evidence collected at the scene. One piece, in particular, would become critical. An unspent bullet. It had been found near the bodies during the initial investigation, but like many pieces of evidence, its significance depended on context. A bullet alone does not identify a suspect. It must be connected to something more specific. A firearm. A person. A chain of possession. As investigators moved forward with renewed focus, they sought to establish that connection. The process of linking a bullet to a specific weapon involves detailed forensic comparison. Marks left on the bullet, even if it has not been fired, can sometimes be matched to the internal mechanisms of a firearm. These markings act like a kind of mechanical signature, unique enough to narrow down possibilities. In Allen's case, attention turned toward whether such a connection could exist. This was not immediate. It required obtaining access to his firearm, analyzing it, and comparing it to the bullet recovered from the scene. Each step had to be conducted carefully, following procedures that would hold up under legal scrutiny. Because at this stage, the investigation was no longer just about identifying a suspect. It was about building a case. A case strong enough to stand in court. As these elements came together, the picture began to sharpen. Allen's presence on the trail. The timeline alignment. The potential forensic connection between the bullet and his firearm. Individually, each piece might not have been sufficient. Together, they began to form something more substantial. Investigators moved carefully. Surveillance, interviews, and additional background checks were conducted to gather as much information as possible. They needed to understand not only whether Allen could be connected to the crime, but how those connections could be demonstrated clearly and convincingly. For the public, this period remained quiet. There were no major announcements. No visible shift that indicated a breakthrough was approaching. But within the investigation, momentum was building. Then, in October 2022, the silence broke. Richard Allen was arrested. The announcement did not come with excessive detail. Law enforcement confirmed the arrest, identified him as the suspect, and indicated that charges had been filed in connection with the murders of Libby and Abby. For a case that had remained unresolved for nearly 6 years, the impact was immediate. Relief, shock, skepticism. All of these reactions existed at once. For many in Delphi, the idea that the person responsible could be someone local, someone who had lived within the community all along, was difficult to process. It challenged assumptions that had formed over time, including the possibility that the suspect might have been an outsider, someone who had come and gone without leaving a trace. Instead, the focus turned inward. Allen was not an unknown figure passing through. He was part of the environment. Part of the same community that had searched, waited, and wondered. That realization carried its own weight. Following the arrest, additional details began to emerge through court documents and investigative disclosures. Allen had acknowledged being on the trail. The bullet found at the scene had been linked, through forensic analysis, to a firearm associated with him. Other elements, including witness statements and behavioral observations, were being integrated into the case. None of this alone explained everything. But together, they created a framework that allowed investigators to move forward with confidence. The breakthrough was not a single moment. It was the result of persistence. Of returning to the beginning. Of refusing to accept that the absence of immediate answers meant the absence of answers entirely. It demonstrated something fundamental about investigations of this kind. That time does not always erase evidence. Sometimes, it simply delays its recognition. For the families of Libby and Abby, the arrest marked a shift that had been years in the making. It did not erase the loss, nor did it fully answer every question, but it changed the trajectory of the case. It moved it from uncertainty into accountability. For the community of Delphi, it brought a different kind of closure. Not complete. Not simple. But real. The man on the bridge was no longer an unknown figure. He had a name. And the process of confronting that reality had only just begun. The arrest of Richard Allen marked the end of one phase of the case, but it did not bring immediate resolution. Instead, it shifted everything into a new arena, one defined not by searching for a suspect, but by proving, with clarity and certainty, that the person in custody was responsible for what had happened on that February afternoon years earlier. The courtroom became the new center of gravity. It was a different kind of space from the trail, from the wooded area, from the bridge where everything began. It was structured, controlled, governed by procedure and precision. Where the investigation had been about gathering fragments, the trial would be about assembling them into a coherent narrative that could withstand scrutiny. For the families of Libby and Abby, entering that space meant confronting the case in a new way. The long years of waiting had been filled with uncertainty, with questions that had no clear answers. Now, those answers would be presented, but not in a way that softened their impact. Instead, they would be laid out in detail, examined, challenged, and repeated. The process was not about comfort. It was about truth. The prosecution began by establishing the foundation of the case. They returned to the beginning, reconstructing the events of February 13, 2017, piece by piece. The timeline was presented carefully, mapping out where Libby and Abby had been, how they had moved through the trail, and the point at which their path intersected with the man captured in the video. That video became one of the central elements of the trial. The image of the man walking on the bridge, the same one that had circulated for years, was shown again, but now within a legal context. It was no longer just a piece of public evidence. It was a component of a structured argument, presented to a jury that would have to determine its significance. The audio followed. The voice. Calm. Measured. The words that had been analyzed so many times were played in court, stripped of speculation, and placed into evidence. The prosecution emphasized its proximity, its clarity, and the implication that the person speaking those words was in direct control of the situation. But the trial could not rely on that alone. The video and audio established presence. They suggested involvement. But they did not, by themselves, identify the man. That connection had to be built through additional evidence. This is where the investigation's long years of work came into focus. The prosecution introduced the fact that Richard Allen had placed himself at the scene. He had acknowledged being on the trail at the relevant time. That statement, once just another piece of information among many, now carried a different weight. It positioned him within the critical window of events, narrowing the range of possibilities. Witness testimony added further context. Individuals who had been on or near the trail that day described seeing a man who matched the general appearance of the figure in the video. Their accounts were not identical, but they shared enough similarities to support the idea that the same individual had been present in multiple locations along the path. The defense challenged these accounts. They questioned the reliability of memory, the influence of time, and the possibility that public exposure to the image of the bridge guy had shaped how witnesses remembered what they saw. These challenges were expected. In a case built on fragments, every piece had to be tested for weakness. Then came the forensic evidence. The unspent bullet. It had been recovered near the bodies during the initial investigation, but its significance had only become clear years later. In court, experts explained the process used to analyze it. They described how markings on the bullet could be compared to the internal mechanisms of a firearm, how these markings could create a link between an object found at a crime scene and a specific weapon. The prosecution presented the conclusion. The bullet was consistent with having been cycled through a firearm associated with Richard Allen. This was not a dramatic moment in the sense of visual impact, but it carried substantial weight. It provided a physical connection between the defendant and the scene, something that extended beyond presence and into material evidence. The defense responded by questioning the methodology. They raised concerns about the reliability of the comparison, the possibility of error, and the degree to which such evidence could be considered definitive. They emphasized that the bullet had not been fired, that its markings might not be as distinct as those created during discharge. The courtroom became a space of competing interpretations. Each side presented its perspective, its reasoning, its attempt to shape how the evidence should be understood. Beyond the physical evidence, the prosecution introduced additional elements intended to strengthen their case. Statements made by Allen were examined. Behavioral patterns were considered. The cumulative effect of these details was to build a narrative that positioned him not just as someone who had been present, but as the person responsible for the crime. The defense, in turn, worked to introduce doubt. They emphasized the absence of certain types of evidence. They questioned whether the case relied too heavily on inference rather than direct proof. They suggested alternative possibilities, not necessarily to provide a complete explanation, but to create uncertainty. Because in a criminal trial, certainty is the standard. Not absolute certainty in a philosophical sense, but legal certainty beyond a reasonable doubt. The jury's role was to evaluate all of this. To listen. To observe. To weigh each piece of evidence against the others. They were not present during the years of investigation. They did not experience the case as it unfolded over time. Instead, they encountered it in concentrated form, within the structured environment of the courtroom, where everything was presented in sequence, with purpose. For the families, each day of the trial brought a different kind of challenge. Hearing details repeated. Seeing evidence displayed. listening to arguments that dissected moments of their loved one's final hours. It is one thing to know what happened. It is another to hear it explained in detail, in a setting where emotion is secondary to process. As the trial moved toward its conclusion, both sides summarized their positions. The prosecution reiterated the connections. Presence on the trail. Alignment with the timeline. The video and audio. The forensic link through the bullet. They argued that these elements, taken together, formed a coherent and compelling case. The defense emphasized the gaps, the uncertainties, the possibility that the evidence, while suggestive, did not reach the level required for conviction. Then the case was handed to the jury. Deliberation is a quiet process. There are no public arguments, no visible debate. It takes place behind closed doors, where jurors discuss, question, and attempt to reach a shared conclusion based on the evidence presented. Time during deliberation feels different for those waiting. For the families, it is another period of uncertainty, though of a different kind. The investigation had lasted years, but now the outcome rested in the hands of a small group of individuals who had to decide whether the case had been proven. When the verdict was reached, it brought an end to that phase of waiting. Guilty. On all counts. The decision did not come with dramatic display. It came as a formal statement, delivered within the controlled environment of the courtroom. But its impact was immediate. For the families, it marked a point of accountability. Not closure in the sense of erasing what had happened, but confirmation that the person held responsible had been identified and judged. Sentencing followed. Richard Allen was given a sentence of 130 years in prison. A number that, in practical terms, ensures he will spend the remainder of his life incarcerated. The courtroom, which had been a place of examination and argument, became a place of conclusion. But even in that conclusion, the complexity of the case remained. Justice, in this context, is not a restoration of what was lost. It is a recognition of responsibility. An acknowledgement, within the structure of law, that an act occurred, that it was committed by a specific individual, and that consequences have been imposed. For Delphi, the trial answered the question that had lingered for years. The man on the bridge had been identified. But the memory of the bridge itself, the trail, the moment when everything changed, remained untouched by the outcome. Because while the legal process had reached its end, the story of Libby and Abby did not conclude with a verdict. It continued in the lives of those who remembered them, in the quiet spaces where their absence was still felt, and in the lasting awareness that something that began on an ordinary afternoon had left a mark that no sentence could fully erase. After the verdict was read and the sentence delivered, Delphi did not return to what it had been before. There is a common expectation that justice, once completed, restores balance, that it closes something cleanly and allows life to continue as it once did. But in reality, the end of a trial does not erase the years that came before it, nor does it remove the imprint left by the event itself. It changes the shape of the silence. Before the arrest, before the trial, the silence in Delphi had been filled with uncertainty. Questions hung in the air without answers. People spoke carefully, often circling around the same unresolved point. Who did this, and where are they now? That uncertainty created a kind of tension that was always present, even when unspoken. After the conviction, that question no longer existed. It had been answered. But what replaced it was something more complex. Now, the silence carried memory instead of uncertainty. It held the weight of what was known, not what was unknown. And that difference, while subtle, changed how people lived with the case moving forward. The Monon High Bridge Trail remained where it had always been. The structure did not disappear. The trees continued their seasonal cycles, bare in winter, full in summer, shifting quietly as time moved forward. The creek below flowed as it always had, indifferent to the events that had taken place above it. But the meaning of the place had changed permanently. People still visited, but not in the same way. Walking the trail was no longer a purely casual act. It carried awareness, an understanding that something significant had occurred there. For some, the bridge became a place of reflection. For others, it was avoided entirely, too closely tied to a memory that could not be separated from the physical environment. Memory attaches itself to places differently than it does to objects. It does not fade easily when reinforced by location. The bridge was not just a structure anymore. It was part of a story that had been told repeatedly, examined, and ultimately resolved in a courtroom, but never fully settled in the emotional sense. For the families of Libby and Abby, the aftermath existed on a different level. The trial had provided answers, but answers do not undo loss. They do not return what was taken, nor do they erase the years spent waiting for resolution. Instead, they create a new phase of living with the outcome, one that is defined less by searching and more by remembering. Grief does not follow a clear timeline. It does not move in a straight line from pain to acceptance. It shifts. It revisits. It changes shape over time, sometimes becoming quieter, sometimes returning with unexpected intensity. For the families, the years after the trial were not about closure in a complete sense. They were about carrying forward the memory of two lives that had been interrupted, finding ways to honor them in a world that continued moving. Communities often respond to events like this by creating forms of remembrance. Memorials. Gatherings. Moments set aside to acknowledge what happened and who was lost. In Delphi, these acts became part of the ongoing narrative of the case, a way for the community to hold on to Libby and Abby as individuals, not just as victims of a crime. Because that distinction matters. Over time, high-profile cases can reduce people to their final moments, to the details of what happened to them rather than who they were before it. But within the community, within their families, Libby and Abby remained more than that. They were remembered for their personalities, their friendships, their presence in everyday life. That remembrance became a form of resistance against the idea that the crime defined them completely. The case itself left a broader impact beyond Delphi. It became an example often referenced in discussions about long-term investigations, about the persistence required to solve cases that do not yield immediate answers. It demonstrated how evidence can remain relevant years after it is collected, how revisiting information with new perspective can change the direction of an investigation. But beyond its technical aspects, the case also raised more difficult questions. About safety in places that feel familiar. About the assumptions people make regarding their environment. About how communities process events that disrupt their sense of normalcy. Delphi was not a place that had expected to face something like this. Its identity had been shaped by stability, by routine, by a sense of predictability that comes from living in a smaller, closely connected environment. The case altered that identity, not completely, but enough to be noticeable. Parents became more cautious. Conversations about safety became more explicit. The idea that danger could exist within the boundaries of the familiar was no longer abstract. It had been experienced. And that experience does not disappear once the person responsible has been identified. It remains, influencing behavior in subtle ways. At the same time, there was also a form of resilience that emerged. Communities do not remain frozen in the moment of tragedy forever. They adapt. They rebuild their sense of normalcy, even if it is slightly different from before. Over time, the intensity of the event becomes part of the town's history rather than its immediate present. But history, especially of this kind, does not become neutral. It retains emotional weight. New residents learn about it. Visitors hear about it. It becomes part of how the town is understood from the outside. For those who lived through it, that understanding is more personal. It is tied to specific days, specific moments, specific memories that are not shared in the same way by those who learn about the case later. The story of Libby and Abby exists in both of these spaces. As a widely known case, and as a deeply personal loss. The intersection of those perspectives creates a complex legacy. On one hand, the case brought attention, resources, and ultimately resolution through a lengthy investigative process. On the other, it left behind a reminder that even places defined by familiarity are not immune to acts that disrupt that sense of security. The role of time in all of this is difficult to measure. Years passed between the day of the crime and the moment of resolution. During that time, lives continued. People aged. Circumstances changed. But the case remained present, moving alongside everything else. When it finally reached its conclusion, it did not erase those years. It simply marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. One where the focus shifted from finding answers to living with them. In that sense, the aftermath is not a fixed point. It is ongoing. It exists in the way people speak about the case, in the way they remember the girls, in the way the community continues to define itself in relation to what happened. There is no single moment where everything feels resolved. Instead, there are smaller moments. A quiet visit to the trail. A memory shared between friends. A name spoken in remembrance rather than in question. These moments do not replace what was lost. But they create a way of carrying it forward. The story of Delphi does not end with a verdict. It continues in the spaces between memory and daily life, in the balance between acknowledging what happened and continuing to move forward despite it. And in that balance, Libby and Abby remain present, not as figures frozen in a single moment, but as part of a larger narrative that extends beyond the crime itself, into the ongoing reality of those who remember them. Time has a way of softening edges, but it does not erase outlines. In Delphi, the years following the trial did not dissolve the memory of what happened. Instead, they settled it into the structure of everyday life, where it remained present in quieter, less visible ways. People returned to routines, to work, to school, to conversations that did not always circle back to the same event. But the awareness lingered, not as something constantly spoken, but as something understood. The town continued forward, but not unchanged. There is a difference between forgetting and adapting. Delphi did not forget. It adapted. The familiarity of its streets, its small businesses, its open spaces remained, but they carried a layer of awareness that had not existed before. It was subtle, something you could only recognize if you had known the place prior to February 2017. A slight hesitation in how certain places were approached. A greater attention to detail in moments that once felt automatic. Parents paid closer attention to where their children went and when they were expected back. Teenagers, who once moved through the town with an unspoken sense of freedom, found that freedom reshaped by caution. Not entirely restricted, but more defined. The assumption that nothing could happen here had been replaced with the understanding that something had happened. And that understanding does not disappear. The Monon High Bridge Trail, in particular, became a place of dual meaning. It still existed as a physical location, accessible, walkable, unchanged in structure. But it also existed as a symbolic space, one that carried the memory of a moment that had altered the town's perception of itself. Some people continued to visit it regularly. For them, the act of walking the trail was a way of reclaiming it, of refusing to let it exist only as the site of a crime. They moved across the bridge with intention, aware of its history, but unwilling to surrender its place in their lives entirely. Others stayed away. For them, the association was too strong, too immediate. The image of the bridge was inseparable from what had occurred there, and distance felt like the only way to manage that connection. Both responses existed side by side, reflecting the different ways people process events that carry emotional weight. The case also left a lasting impression beyond Delphi, influencing how similar investigations were viewed and approached. It became a reference point for discussions about evidence, about persistence, about the role of technology in modern criminal cases. Libby's decision to record, made in a moment that could not have been fully understood at the time, became one of the most significant elements in the eventual resolution. That detail carried its own kind of meaning. It suggested that even in situations where control is limited, where circumstances shift rapidly, small actions can have lasting impact. It did not change what happened, but it changed what could be known about it later. In that sense, the case was not only about loss, but also about the fragments that remain after loss, the pieces that allow events to be reconstructed, understood, and ultimately addressed. For investigators, it reinforced the importance of returning to evidence, of not allowing time to diminish its potential value. The breakthrough that led to the arrest of Richard Allen did not come from something entirely new. It came from re-examining what had already been there, from looking again at information that had once seemed ordinary and finding within it something that had been missed. That approach, that willingness to revisit and reconsider, became part of the case's broader significance. But for those closest to Libby and Abby, the meaning of the case was never abstract. It was personal. It existed in memories that did not require investigation or analysis. In moments recalled not as evidence, but as lived experience. The way someone laughed. The way they spoke. The small details that define a person in the eyes of those who knew them. These memories do not fade in the same way public attention does. They remain consistent, even as time passes, even as the case moves from active investigation to documented history. In the years after the trial, efforts to honor Libby and Abby continued. Not in ways that drew constant attention, but in quieter acts of remembrance. Events held on anniversaries. Spaces dedicated to preserving their names. Conversations that ensured they were remembered not only for what happened to them, but for who they were before it. These acts do not resolve grief, but they provide structure to it. They create moments where memory is shared rather than carried alone. At the same time, the broader world began to move on, as it often does. New cases emerged. New stories captured public attention. The intensity of focus that had once surrounded Delphi shifted elsewhere. But within the town, the story remained. Not at the forefront of every day, but never entirely absent. There is a tendency to think of cases like this in terms of beginning and end. A crime occurs. An investigation follows. A suspect is identified. A trial is held. A verdict is delivered. The sequence suggests a clear progression, a movement from uncertainty to resolution. But the reality is less defined. The end of the legal process does not mark the end of the story. It marks a transition. From searching to remembering. From questioning to understanding. From active investigation to lived aftermath. That transition is not uniform. It happens differently for different people, at different times, in different ways. Some find a sense of peace in the resolution. Others continue to feel the weight of unanswered questions, of details that may never be fully known or explained. Both responses are valid. Because the case, while resolved in a legal sense, still contains elements that exist beyond the reach of definitive explanation. The exact sequence of moments. The internal motivations. The full context of what occurred in those final minutes. These are aspects that may never be completely understood. And so, the story remains partially open, not in terms of who was responsible, but in terms of how it is processed, remembered, and carried forward. Delphi continues to exist as it always has, a small town shaped by its geography, its people, its routines. But within that structure, the memory of Libby and Abby has become part of its identity. Not in a way that defines it entirely, but in a way that cannot be separated from it. Visitors who come to the town may see the bridge, the trail, the quiet streets. They may hear about the case, learn its details, understand its significance. But for those who live there, the story is not something encountered once and set aside. It is part of the background. A presence that does not demand constant attention, but does not disappear either. And in that presence, the lives of Libby and Abby continue to matter. Not only because of how they were lost, but because of how they are remembered. The case, in all its complexity, ultimately returns to that point. Two girls. A moment in time. A community that was changed by their absence. And a lasting effort to ensure that what happened is neither forgotten nor reduced to a single narrative, but understood as part of a larger human experience that continues long after the final verdict has been delivered.